My name is Liz Roberts. I'm going to be recording a series of lessons of the history of God's people between the Testaments. I'm actually doing this in preparation for a series that I'm going to record for this particular website, A Shared Inheritance, on the harmony of the Gospels. But before we begin a study of Jesus, it's important for us to briefly remember the nation that will bring forth this Messiah, who will bring the good tidings and the gospel message to a dark world, a message that resonates in our lives. It's the foundation of what anchors us as we are sojourners in this temporary dwelling. It's a history of a remnant people who remain faithful in various circumstances in different lands. They are dispersed pretty early on in their history compared to the New Testament, that we want to discuss in this study of between the Testaments. I think it's important for us to understand what happened as we open the curtains to the stages of the New Testament, to understand who these people are, why they are living in so many different places, who these people are that live between Galilee and Judea, smack dab in the middle of this nation that we read so well about in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then of course throughout Acts. They're ruled by Herods, never mentioned in the Old Testament, not considered rightful kings. How did that come about? When did that happen? They're meeting in synagogues. Never read anything about that in the Old Testament. But we read extensively from the get-go in the New Testament about the synagogues and how important they were as the centers of the religious activities of the lives of those that Jesus had such close contact with, and Jesus himself, actually. And so we think about, they spoke Greek. How did that happen? Particularly later, the apostles, but especially people like Stephen, some of the ones that are that quote scriptures later in the book of Acts, quote from the Septuagint. What is that? When did that come about? Why was that such a widely used version of God's word? And so I think it's important to understand these things as we begin to encounter a real in-depth study of the gospel messages. And so that is what I'm going to do in this series between the Testaments, and hopefully it will help you. Now, we're going to go back and we're going to look at some biblical texts that I feel like many of you will be familiar with, but just to bring us up to the point in which we end the Old Testament, to remind ourselves of where we are and who these people were. If you look at this map that's on the screen, and if you're listening and you don't have a map, this is a map really of the promised land, and then the lands north and northeast of the promised land. As we recall from Old Testament history, Solomon was the last king of a united Israel. Israel was divided. It became known as the divided kingdom. The northern nation was the nation of Israel. The southern nation was the nation of Judah. 10 tribes were located and situated in the northern kingdom of Israel. Israel struggled much more with their spirituality. They set up immediately, high places were set up. They began to not travel at all down to Jerusalem for the holy days and the feast. They were much more influenced by their neighbors, which had not been destroyed utterly as God had asked them to do. Lots of history there. We're not going to cover all the biblical history. I think probably most of you know that history. But Israel was taken about 150 years prior to the nation of Judah being taken into captivity. The northern kingdom was taken by the Assyrians. They are the Syrians, the Syrians today. And if you really studied the Old Testament history, you know that the Assyrians then much of their land was taken into the Babylonian Empire. And then, of course, the Persian Empire became an even broader spreading empire. It was actually a weaker empire. It lasted a shorter amount of time. But but it took the land in of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Of course, Esther, Nehemiah, Ezra, those folks all experienced those Persian leaders. And so if you study Bible, Old Testament history, you're very familiar with all of that. But Israel was taken by the Assyrians, the northern nation of Israel was taken by the Assyrians into Assyria. The Assyrians were one of the first civilizations, if not the first civilization, to take their captives and not go in and dwell among them and make them work for them. But they took their captives out of the lands in which they were born and raised and belonged to, so to speak. And they took them into their own land in order that they might assimilate and become Assyrian. And we know that this happens. I mean, this is what happens. This is why you get a family here in America that's transplanted or comes and they travel to America, their children and certainly their grandchildren. Most Americans would not realize even who they are because you assimilate to the culture that you are around. It's not always a bad thing. That means your language, your dress, the way that you conduct your daily life fits into and accommodates the needs of that particular culture. Now we know that this is a biblical thing that God is teaching these people that they can live in the world and not of the world. I tend to act and look and dress like an American because that is who I am. That's where I live. When I was in Germany, had I lived in Germany for much longer, I would have assimilated and somewhat did assimilate to that particular culture because it's a necessity. You act and you talk and you speak and you dress like those around you culturally. We realize from the story of Esther, one of the greatest things we learn about in the book of Esther is that though they did not understand or know, they could not sense that she was a Hebrew. They could not sense that she was a child of God by the way she looked and dressed. They had very little interaction with her. But when they began to have interaction with her, then the heart began to show. And of course, who she was defined deeply and very firmly by what it was that she believed and who it was that she was. And these people were going to begin to learn that lesson. It is a lesson that is a very important lesson for us to know and to teach our own children. That we live in a land culturally where our flesh accommodates what needs to be done, but our minds and our hearts belong in a heavenly kingdom. We bring that heavenly kingdom to earth as much as we can through our own existence and through Christ living in us. And they were going to begin to know that. That's what Esther and Mordecai understood. That's what Daniel purposed in his heart as he was taken away into Babylonian captivity. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But those are important principles for us to understand as people of God, no matter where we live. If you're in the Seychelles and you're watching this, you act and dress like a Seychellois, you talk like a Seychellois, but you are joined and united in this heavenly kingdom with those of us in America and in Germany and in Addis Ababa and all throughout the world. And of course, that is what is so wonderful about this kingdom of ours. And so what they were beginning to learn is that their existence and who they were wasn't based off the land that they lived in. So they were taken by the Assyrians. They were taken north and east, as you can see from the map. And they actually, these 10 tribes had struggled so much anyway with who they were that they had really become lost to idolatry. They actually become known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. I'm sure you've probably heard that. And I think there was always a remnant. I believe there was always a remnant, but as a people, they really struggled. They never had a king that was a faithful king to God. They never were able to draw themselves back into what it was that God needed them to be until the years after captivity. All right, so the southern kingdom of Judah was taken by a much kinder enemy. They were taken by the Babylonians. By this point, Babylon or the world was becoming more educated, more sophisticated. These people were known as the Chaldeans. If you read in your Bible text that they were taking them back to become Chaldeans to learn the language and the philosophies and the theologies of the Chaldeans. That's because that's what the Babylonians were called. And so the Babylonians will eventually absorb much of that Assyrian empire. They will take in a lot of those folks. So that all happens as history unfolds itself. I will briefly mention here on this map, if you're able to see the map, the orange arrows indicate those Gentiles that are taken back into the land. The land struggled a little bit after all of the children of Israel were taken out by the Assyrians and by the Babylonians, and particularly Babylonians, but even the Assyrians sent back into that land Gentiles, particularly the Babylonians who would cultivate the land. Those Babylonians, those Gentile people, had the thought process that if they worshiped the gods of the land, that the land would then be good to them. So that's why we see Samaritans intermingling with some of the Israelites, weaker Israelites who were not able to be brought out. They were weaker. They were unable to be led that far away lest they die. Some of the ones that had some handicaps or possibly even lepers were left behind. They began to intermingle. The Gentiles began to rely on them. We're going to talk a little bit more about this history in this particular class, but they became what's known as the Samaritans. They settled in Samaria. And so those will be the people. And we'll talk more about them because there's even more history there. But they are the ones that become the Samaritan people. And so you see that beginning right here as those Babylonians are sending Gentiles back into that land in order to cultivate and live on that land, and of course make their nation and their empire bigger and bigger and bigger and broader and broader and more populated. And so that's the beginning of the Samaritans there as well. So let's just remember, about 600 years before Jesus was born, during the days of the Babylonian captivity, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, the most powerful and wealthy kingdom in the Middle East at that time, he had a dream. He was the one that had come in, taken the nation of Judah, burned and destroyed utterly Jerusalem. And he is the one that will care for Daniel, take Daniel, and hope to have Daniel become Chaldean, Daniel and his friends. All right, I'm going to read the biblical text at the end of 2 Chronicles in chapter 36, starting in verse 15. It tells that the Lord God of their fathers, that he had sent warnings to them by his messengers, rising up early and sending them because he had compassion for his people. I think he had, well, I know it says that he had hoped that the people of Judah would hear him and his prophets that he had sent, but they mocked the messengers of God. They despised his word. They scoffed at the prophets until the wrath of God arose against his people, until there was no remedy. And therefore he brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, who is Nebuchadnezzar. He's identified in Daniel, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of the sanctuary and had no compassion on the young man or the virgin, on the aged or the weak. He gave them all into his hand. God gave them all into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. And all the articles of the house of God, great and small, treasures of the house of the Lord, treasures of the king and his leaders, all of these he took into Babylon. And we're going to see later at the end of Daniel, those are the cups and the utensils that Belshazzar is drinking from and partying with and banqueting with at the end on the night that the Medes and the Persians come into Babylon. They block their waterways. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. They burned down the house of God, it says in 2 Chronicles. They broke the wall of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces in fire, and destroyed the precious possessions. If you read the history of this destruction, it is gone. Jerusalem is gone. The temple is gone. There is nothing left but smoldering piles of ashes. It is absolutely destroyed. I'm going to go to the first chapter of the book of Daniel as well. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Judah, came into Jerusalem and besieged it. He talks about how he carried away into the land of Shinar all of the things out of the house of God. He took among them the young men in whom there was no blemish, good looking, gifted in wisdom, possessing knowledge, quick to understand, had the ability to serve in the king's palace. This was Daniel's future. You know, you feel sorry for your children. This is what they did. These young men, they took them to become Chaldeans, to assimilate them, to be Babylonian. In verse 8, just so we remind ourselves of what it is that we can do when we find ourselves in circumstances and situations beyond our control that we had not expected. And Daniel in verse 8 purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself, that he would remain faithful to the God of Israel, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that he would remain who he was. And so those are important things for us to understand. Those are great lessons, which I'm not going to do here, but those are great lessons for us to remember as parents, what it is that we want for our children. Would it be the greatness of the palaces of the king of Nebuchadnezzar? Or would it be that they purpose in their hearts that they will not defile themselves, even though they're going to live among those sorts of things? So in chapter 2 of Daniel, we are told that Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. Not long after Daniel is taken into the palace, Daniel prays to God that he might be able to reveal the meaning of this dream, and that he might tell him the interpretation. And as we know, I think most of us know, and it's on the slide, this dream showed a statue with 4 different sections. The head was gold, which represented the Babylonian Empire. The chest and the arms were silver, which represented the Medes and the Persians. We understand that the iron, the thighs, and the half of the abdomen and the thighs were bronze, which would represent the Grecian Empire, and the legs were iron mixed with clay. And so the statue takes us through the years. It takes us from 600 years prior, from the Babylonian captivity to the days of Jesus. 600 years the statue will represent for us. 600 years before Jesus was born, we are told what will happen. And so this represents 600 years of history. This statue does. And as we understand that the church is foreseen as this great rock that strikes and destroys it, and it becomes this huge mountain and fills the whole earth. And of course, that is us. And so it allows us to see ourselves as what? So more than 600 years now have passed. And so, of course, Daniel tells the king what everything represents, and that the head represents Babylon, which God himself had given to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had not earned that on his own, but God had given it to Nebuchadnezzar to rule over. The gold symbolizes this superior nation of Babylon. Actually, Babylon was, if you look at the side of this slide, you'll see the years that these empires lasted. And as you can see, the Medo-Persian was really kind of the weakest empire there. It's certainly the weakest of the metals, but Babylon would be destroyed by an inferior nation. We'll talk about a little bit later on in this particular class, this Between the Testaments, we're going to see Babylon taken by the Persians and how it's taken. A lot of you probably already know that history, but it's interesting to think about. And so more than 50 years later, Daniel himself in chapter 7 will have a vision of these 4 beasts, which are on the far left part of this slide here. And the beasts represent the same kingdoms, and you'll see it on the slide. And they are of course, the lion with the eagle wings, and then the bear, and then the leopard, and then this terrifying evil beast, which in Daniel 7, we're given a lot more information about the Roman Empire itself. All right. But this is the only biblical reference which gives us any insight into the 400-year span that falls between the final messages of Nehemiah and Malachi and the messages in Luke and Matthew that tell us of the impending births of John and Jesus. It is the telling of this vision and this dream that we are able to glimpse into those future years. And while this glimpse is just a little bitty, and this vision is just a little peephole, the view for us as Christians is panoramic view. I mean, this is it. We get this. We understand. It takes us from this time of Nebuchadnezzar until we understand the kingdom's establishment and who it is that we are. And we see that God himself is always and has always been in control of the nations and the rulers in order that the will of God, the plan of salvation, the redemption of man would succeed. And it is absolutely clear, and I believe with all my heart, that every event that needed to take place in order for the path to be made clear for the coming Messiah was not a mistake, but was the providence of the Almighty God. And when we leave the text in the Old Testament, the kingdom symbolized in silver in this dream is the strongest and most powerful nation in that day. But we're going to take a brief little stroll through the history to look at what each power did to mold the lives of those that we meet in the beginning of the gospel messages. Let's just figure out who these people are that we meet at the beginning of the gospel messages. I'm just going to briefly look back at these kingdoms because it immediately begins to impact. This captivity immediately begins to impact some of the things that we see in the New Testament with the people of God. The head of gold. And about 68 to 69 years after Daniel is taken into Babylon, the Medes and the Persians will come into Babylon and take it. And then, of course, we know for sure that 70 years later, just as was prophesied 150 years prior by Isaiah, the king then will write a decree for the Israelites to go back into Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. That will happen 70 years after they're taken. And Babylon has taken Judah pretty easily. It is interesting. We see through the history of the Babylonian kings that the Babylonians had come into Jerusalem at various times. Hezekiah had showed all the treasures of Jerusalem to Merodach Baladan, and one of the kings of Babylon before Nebuchadnezzar, and he hadn't worried at all about Babylon. He was so worried about Assyria taking him. Assyria had gone south of him and destroyed Lachish, one of the cities of Judah, and had Hezekiah in Jerusalem bound up like a bird in a cage, he says. And remember, that's when Hezekiah has to dig the water supply from out in the valley of Kidron into Jerusalem. He's not got Babylon on his radar at all, but they were distraught. I mean, these people of Judah were distraught when they were taken into Babylon. Psalms tells us they sat by the rivers of Babylon and cried and said, we can't be the people of God without being in our land. How are we ever going to be the people of God in Babylon, in this foreign, ungodly Gentile land? How will we be who it is that we need to be? Do you remember those passages? And so we go back and we read, this is the letter, of course, that Jeremiah had written and given to the people. In the first verse, it says, this is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles, and to the priests and the prophets and all the other people Hezekiah had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. This was written prior, but given to them. Remember, Jeremiah was the weeping prophet. He knew this was all going to happen. And he had begged the people to do what needed to be done. And those in Judah were living in the Babylonian captivity and kingdom. They would be instructed in this letter of what it is that they should do. They were beginning to realize that when you belong to God, you don't really, the nation you belong to, the nation you live in, the place you live in is not what really matters. And God had well in advance given them some instructions. Thus say the Lord of hosts of God to all who are carried away captive, whom I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem to Babylon. You build your houses, you dwell in them, you plant gardens, you eat the fruit, take your wives, have your children marry each other. Seek peace of the city from which I've carried you captive, to which I've carried you captive. For in it you will have peace. He said, you go in and you live like you ought to, and you obey me, and you continue to remember me and to keep my commandments. You remember to have a relationship with me, and you continue to live your life just like you would. You see, God's people had begun to rely on the land for their religious activity, and their hearts were secured in that land somehow without actually having to think about their relationship with God. And so for the very first time, they were going to have to do that. This is a list of the kings of Babylon. Real quickly, I'm not going to go through this to any detail, but actually the first mentioned in the scriptures is this Merodach Baladan, the second, and he's the one that came to Hezekiah in 2 Kings, the 20th chapter, and Hezekiah shows him all the treasures of Jerusalem. Isaiah prophesies, actually. He says, I'm not telling you what, everything you showed him, it's going to be carried away to Babylon one day. Of course, they could not even imagine that. It's Nebuchadnezzar, of course, who's mentioned most often. We have the best idea of him and his personality through the book of Daniel, of course, and the content is so powerful there for us to understand Babylon. But several others are mentioned in the scriptures. This chart shows you those. Evil Merodach is the king of Babylon, who shows Jehoiakim mercy. I don't know if you remember that, but he released him from prison and he gave him the rations of a king. And Nelgar-Sharezer is mentioned in Jeremiah as one of the princes that is serving under Nebuchadnezzar at the time of the fall of Jerusalem. And so there are documented biblical pieces of these kings. But this exile in Babylon brought these Jews to a new, fresh realization of the nature of their God. And they were going to begin to mature and to grow in captivity. Yes, they would be dispersed. And yes, they would be out in lands that were not the promised land. Not necessarily, culturally, they were not going to look like the people immediately around them. Idolatry had been rampant during the years before the fall of Jerusalem. You know, we can relate to what is being taught to these people. We can relate. These people living in the land that God had given, they were impressed by the convenience and the philosophies of the cultural religion of the day. Their God seemed so complicated and was not tangible enough. And so they began to be idolatrous and have gods that were tangible to them, like the people that they had left living among them. They had already been influenced by those who lived around them. And now they were taken from that land, and they were going to have to reevaluate the real God, the God that had given them that land, the God that's not tangible, but is defined by faith. And they would remember now the words of the prophet as they looked back, the prophets as they looked back. And as they recall the activities of what they had done as they lived in the land that had been promised to them by a God who had been so good to them, and yet being influenced by those around them. And so now they were going to have to live in a land surrounded by those. And they were going to have to reevaluate the words of the prophets. And I think that there were always those who were faithful. We know that from Daniel. And I think those people knew that this was a punishment, that they had heard the words of the prophets. And when all of this happened, they said, that was what was promised, and we are being punished. And we're going to have to figure this out, because our God is the true God, and this is worth living for, no matter where I am. The temple was gone. Animal sacrifices ceased. In place of the temple now, we begin, if you read secular history, it is well believed that this is the time when synagogues will begin to appear in these areas of disbursement for these faithful Jews, or those who understood that they were being punished and they were coming back to God out of idolatrous practices, coming back into the law. And we begin to see synagogues cropping up. And though we have no real record of the exact time that these centers of worship appear, Jewish traditions and writings indicate that it is during these years of captivity in Babylon. Remember, if you look at those passages in Psalms, they sit by the rivers of Babylon and they cry out, "Where will we worship? Our temple is gone." Once the temple in Jerusalem was gone, the captive Jews who remained faithful and depended upon the temple for their holy sacrifices and their festivals and the feasts were left without a center of religious activity for their daily lives. And when the armies of Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem and its temple, it was known throughout the world that the gods of Babylon were more powerful than the God of Israel. And the God of Israel, who had done so much and done so well in protecting his people, was no longer able, or he was no longer willing. And that's what these people that had been taken had to contend with. That's what Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and later Esther and Mordecai had to contend with. That's what was thought of their God, who had been feared, by the way, by the nations as they were coming into the promised land. But the faithful in the nation understood, and they understood that it was their disobedience and their unfaithfulness that had led to this destruction. They had been influenced in this land, this very land that God had given them. The prophets, the faithful, they understood properly that this was the chastising of the holy and living God of Israel, and that the destruction of Israel and Judah's cities, the temple and the captivity were all evidence of his sovereign power and the promise to those who had left him. And they would now begin to understand the promise to those who would never leave him, who would be a part of the remnant. These are new spiritual concepts that are being taught. This captivity, it would be 70 plus years. And they would have to learn how to deal with this. And they would never really ever rightfully have their land back. We're going to stop here for today, and we're going to take a look next at the synagogues and the places of worship and how those would have been essential during this time of Babylonian captivity.